A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second seminar of the 2024 Fall Seminar Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Irini Kotsovili. I'm a member of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies and a member of the Department of Global Humanities, and will serve as the moderator for today's discussion to follow and to present our speaker. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. We have with us today our speaker, Dr. Evangelia Chordaki, a historian of science working at the intersection of gender studies, science studies, history of science, and science communication. Her research about the Greek feminist birth control movement investigates the different forms of knowledge and expertise that move beyond the classical dichotomies between theory and practice, body and mind. Her broader research interests include the distribution of expertise during the COVID-19 pandemic, the intertwinement between gender, technoscience, and digitality, posthumanism, the relationship between masculinities, communism, and science in the Greek 20th century. She holds a PhD in science communication and gender studies from the Hellenic Open University that was funded by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation. She has a Master of Science in History and Philosophy of Science and Technology and a BA in History and Philosophy of Science from the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. She has previously held a postdoctoral position at the National Hellenic Research Foundation. And with that, Dr. Chordaki, please, welcome.
Thank you, Irini, and thank you, Dr. Kralis, and also Heather for all the help and the hospitality, and of course, the Center for the invitation. I would like also to thank all of you for being here today online and in person. I hope we will have a good presentation and afterwards a good discussion, so I can't wait to hear your feedback. So my talk today, as the title shows, will focus on the knowledge orders and disorders in relation to a specific social event of the late 20th century, the Greek feminist birth control movement. Nevertheless, before starting, I would like to briefly situate myself and my research. This research is part of my PhD titled Science Communication in the Late 20th Century Greece, Public Intersections of Gender and Knowledge Circulation in the Feminist Birth Control Movements, that took place in Athens in the aftermath of the Greek financial crisis that resulted in poverty, uncertainty, the proliferation of nationalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. During those years, most aspects of the social and political life changed, and one is related to knowledge. Knowledge production and circulation occurred in unexpected spaces and through unpredicted processes and forms of organization. My initial academic interest in the relationship between science and the public spheres soon ended up in another era of political significance, metapolitefsi, the era of the democratic transition, with particular concern in exploring the relationship outside the safe zone, in the margins and periphery of the society, in the overlooked places and overheard voices where science and society meet. Growing up as a woman in Greece, a country that maintains traditional values about family, motherhood, sexuality, and gender roles, and strong ties with the church, is often a struggle. A struggle I experienced even more intensively was that I come from a small city on the north of Greece called Florina, as you can see on the map, where taboos and secrecies around those issues were and still remain a norm. Hence, the case of the feminist birth control movement was compatible with my feminist self, my interest as a historian of science, and my social position as a woman. And then the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. One of the numerous things that happened was the transformation of science communication as one of the ultimate issues that matter, making the social character of science visible and reshaping the relationship between science and politics. My talk is initiated from this research, but is based on my forthcoming book titled Making Sense of Knowledge, Feminist Epistemologies of the Greek Birth Control Movement, which was completed last year during my postdoctoral fellowship at the Seeker Center for Hellenic Studies at Princeton University. Today, I want to invite you to think with me and critically revisit contemporary reproductive knowledges, their orders and disorders, in relation to two major issues I want to raise. One is the need to discuss the relationship between social and epistemic justice. And two is the relevance of revisiting the tensions between reason and emotion in knowledge production. I will discuss those issues within a specific methodological and conceptual framework. One, this is not a history of the Greek feminist birth control movement, but rather it is a body of fragmented histories of critical feminist epistemologies of reproduction. Two, deliberately and methodologically, I keep the valuable S, this is what I call it, in the notions of knowledges and the publics to stand against monolithic descriptive categories. Three, the concept of gender here is not one of the many aspects of the phenomenon I study, but a type of lens, a way to think, know, and act, and as an integral part of the studied phenomenon. Additionally, it is not a biological category. This is not a history of women and thus a history against men, but rather a history of gendered resistance. And four, I constructively acknowledge the tensions between the local and the transnational, the individual and the collective, the past and the present. Thus, I propose to think of the local as, and not in opposition to the transnational, the individual as the collective, and the relationship between the past and the present as a continuity through transgenerational relationships and not linearity. The Greek feminist birth control movement emerged during the 20th century, and more specifically in the era of the democratic transition in Greece, which is called metapolitefsi. As Liakos argues, the 20th century, from a global perspective, is a historical period that is full of contradictions, embodying overpopulations and genocides, multiple presences of refugees and immigrants, the realization of different kinds of utopias that in many cases became dystopians in the end, the emphasis on human rights, and the struggles for women's emancipation. As he argues, the Greek 20th century is characterized by Greece's openness towards the different historical currents of the period and the creation of a unique theoric opposition between the old and the new, the local and the transnational, the repetition and the change. Even though the Greek 20th century has a long and complex history, I will now focus on the last decades, the era of the democratic transition, metapolitefsi, after the fall of the dictatorial regime in 1974, to provide the historical context of a period in which the feminist birth control movement was saturated. Historiography highlights the political significance of the fall of the dictatorial regime, characterizing it as the breakthrough moment in the Greek political history of the second half of the 20th century, or the Big Bang of contemporary Greece, a landmark in the contemporary Greek history, while Avgeridis, Garzi, and Kornetis emphasized its plural character, characterizing it as a chronotopos. Metapolitefsi, among many things, is characterized by cultural changes, such as the transformation of social and gender relationships, mass consumption, migration, mass tourism, arts, the sexual revolution, the contraceptive pill, autonomy from the family, the creation of new social spaces, visibility, the free time, reconstruction of gender identities. This period after the fall of the dictatorial regime was identified as a dynamic emergence of social and political movements, such as the feminist movement, the LGBT movement, anti-militarist movements, the ecological movement, the social movements for peace, which, as Karamanolakis and Karpoulos argue, shaped the balances and priorities of the period. Here, the university's role was crucial. It ensured the necessary conditions for the politicization of the young generation, in which the notion of autonomy was at the center of the attention for questioning the political and social establishment. According to the authors, autonomy is apparent in the presence of multiple movements, campaigns, and groups of the period that use the term in their slogans and names, the appearance of publishing houses, and the numerous social movements. Thus, the Greek feminist birth control movement belonged in these multiple cultures of metapoliteracy. To understand the feminist movement's historical characteristics, it is important to acknowledge briefly, at least, the history of the Greek feminist movement. The first feminist attempts in Greece took place in the middle of the 19th century, when women's voices aimed to improve women's social position and their access to education. Later on, in the late 19th century, we meet the first women's associations and magazines focusing on women's participation in public life and elections. During the first decades of the 20th century, we notice the systematic presence of women's organization and women's participation in the Communist Party. Thus, women started working regarding their political rights, equity, work conditions, access to education, family, and motherhood. At the same time, from 1940s to 1974, several anti-fascist women's organizations and other unions emerged that the military junta later on criminalized them. The fall of the dictatorial regime created a unique condition for the development of different kinds of public life, places, and spaces. Several, often youth and left-wing, social movements emerged. Regarding the feminist movement, it was the moment when we noticed the presence of a broader mass movement for women's emancipation, which imposed new questions and developed numerous practices of resistance against patriarchy and for women's liberation. Vaiou and Psara argued that the periodization of the feminism in metapoliteracy began in 1974 and ended in 1990s, marking an era where new collectives demanded their political visibility, embodying multiple tensions, contradictions, and views, and reclaiming a place in public space and discourses. Such new collectives explore power and gender relationships. In parallel, through the famous slogan, "The personal is political," they try to reveal the political base of gender hierarchies, discriminations, and roles. They struggled for political equality, self-determination, and women's body determination and sexuality. They reclaim of public space, the politicization of the so-called private or personal experiences, recognizing gender, as Athanasiou argues, not only as a field of violent disciplinization and traumatism, but also as a space of collective action towards equality and liberty. Since the 1960s, feminist analysis in the Western Europe and the US has dealt with the decriminalization of abortion and the proliferation of contraception. However, the complicated political conditions in Greece did not allow feminist ideas to flourish until the middle of the 1970s. Junta of the colonials and the oppressive regime did not allow social movements to emerge until 1973, when the Polytechnic Uprising took place in Athens. As a moment of great political importance in contemporary Greek history, the dynamic rebellion against the dictatorial regime culminated on November 14, 1973, with the occupation of the National Technical University of Athens, and ended with the bloodshed on November 17 in 1973. The events of 1973 and the fall of the dictatorial regime dynamically shaped the Greek social and political sphere, where feminist movements emerged. After the fall of the dictatorial regime, many Greek women who lived abroad and participated in the European feminist movements returned back to Greece. Thus, the ideological framework of European feminist movements influenced the discourses and practices developed within the Greek feminist birth control movement. It's worth noting that despite being illegal, abortions during that period were a common practice. Hence, since its beginning in 1976, the feminist movement has focused on the decriminalization of abortions and the need for the circulation of medical information about contraception. This dual aim of the feminist birth control movement should show the differentiation between the social groups that participated in it. On the one hand, autonomous feminist groups approached the decriminalization of abortion and the spread of contraception by developing a feminist critique against the main character of dominant science, focusing on self-organization, self-education, and self-determination of the female body. On the other hand, women's organizations, primarily related to political parties, approached the issues as part of state feminism, closely related to family planning, and their demands focused on the institutional framework. Despite their various approaches, both groups coexisted in the Greek public arena, sometimes exchanging argumentations and following completely different paths. As Avdela Papagiannaki and Sklavenitis argue, in 1975, named the International Year of Women by the United Nations, decriminalization of abortions was one of the major topics in a seminar organized by the National Council of Women, the Lyceum Club of Greek Women, the Greek League for Women's Rights, the Association of Greek Women Scientists, Women Christian Association, the Federation of Greek Women, the Association of Greek Women Lawyers, and Zonda Athens. The emergence of the autonomous feminist movement for abortion and contraception is identified with the formation of the movement for the liberation of women in 1976. Its first appearance was accompanied by the introductory brochure, in which they stated that abortion is not a contraceptive method and should be free and legal even for underage girls. Thus, autonomous feminists and women's groups took action in both directions. In 1976, a successful public exhibition regarding contraceptive methods was organized by the Group of Sexuality of the Movement for the Liberation of Women, while at the same time, the Greek Association for Family Planning was established and the Democratic Women's Movement started working on issues related to abortion. 2 years later, in 1978, Karamanlis' right-wing government and Health Minister Doxiadis extended the medical indication with the Law 821, allowing abortion until the 12th week of pregnancy in cases where there was a risk for mental health of the mother. A psychiatrist would provide this evaluation, and until the 20th week in case of severe abnormalities of the fetus. Despite the alteration of their law, feminists continued their struggle based on self-organization, both by organizing feminist groups and publishing numerous articles in feminist magazines and magazines of general interest, aiming to provide information about abortion. Meanwhile, on March 31st, 1979, the International Day of Contraception was celebrated in Greece for the first time. The Women's Group of Law School and the Movement for the Liberation of Women at the University of Athens was organizing a related public event. Gradually, abortion crossed the limits of the private sphere and was introduced into the Greek public landscape as a social and political issue. During the second celebration of the International Day of Contraception, 10 autonomous women's groups distributed proclamations in public about abortion and contraception. Numerous feminist groups gradually appeared 1 year later, sending material with the same concerns. In October 1981, the Pan-Hellenic Social Movement, PASOK, the center-left Social Democratic Party, won the elections, and since the beginning of its governing, committed itself to put an end to this unacceptable regime of illegal abortions with a complete and scientific information on family planning, contraception, and the decriminalization of abortions. The victory of PASOK changed the feminist landscape crucially in Greece, while its commitment to the decriminalization of abortion enabled state feminists to flourish. At the same time, autonomous feminist groups endured their struggles and multiplied. A turning point in the abortion struggles was the Autonomous Women's Movement campaign, which took place in February 1983 and was the first national campaign of the feminist movement in Greece. The campaign was crucial for two reasons. On the one hand, it was a critical factor in promoting the decriminalization of abortions, while on the other hand, it led the involved social groups into a public conflict. Finally, in May 1986, the bill was filed in the parliament and the right of pregnant women to decide freely until the 12th week for the development of their pregnancy was recognized. I will now turn on the orders and disorders of knowledge in this case study. February 1983, Athens, Greece, a moment of adimilima. The Autonomous Women's Movement campaign, the right to abortion, contraception, and sexuality, releases a document signed by 500 women who publicly declared that they had had abortions. This was one of the many acts of backspeaking, answering, or talking back to the existing regime of 300 to 500,000 illegal abortions that took place in Greece every year. The Greek word adimilima refers to such acts. The proposition AD evokes a tension of contradiction and objection, opposition and rejection, reaction and replacement. The word is also linked to impenitence, boldness, shamelessness, and self-assurance. Adimilima is a feminist concept, can be traced back to bell hooks' notion of talking back. In this sense, it is identified as premises, possibilities, limits, commitments, demands, and visions. It poses questions and ensures that there exists stable answer. It produces and produced by affective economies, bodies, emotions, and epistemologies. It maps the registration points through acts, discourses, fights, and struggles. It is a space and the absence of space, the topos and utopia. Adimilima is being, bonding, doing and thinking, moving and feeling. The talk back is to talk back is to dare, disagree, confront, challenge, reclaim, recover, risk, and belong. As such, it creates a world in which acts of resistance are saturated. Adimilima is world knowing and world making. Subjugated knowledges erupt and revolt as acts of resistance while operating as performative perforations. As Sarah Ahmed argues, such acts of speaking out or speaking against imply a confrontation with established truth, thus turning critical epistemologies, as Athanasiou argues, into adimilima. If feminists developed experiential knowledge, this is what I argue, what is the status of this experiential in relation to the scientific? Thinking towards this direction, the feminist birth control movement becomes a history of confronting institutional forms of knowledges and expertises, invading hostile intellectual and epistemic spaces, focusing on how feminist activists transform their experiences by reclaiming the relationship with knowledges, while at the same time centralizing the crucial role of emotion as being understood within a specific historical and cultural context. It becomes a history of how experiences of being feminist transform knowledge production about birth control by critically renegotiating the binary emotion and reason. As affective epistemologies of adimilima rising from the margins, those bodies of knowledge about the body depict the crucial role of the geographical and epistemological peripheries, recentering the collective localities of the gender bodies that feel and experience, without separating emotions from the senses. Here, body politics, politics of knowledge, and politics of emotions establish a feminist framework for the critical re-examination of the relationship between authoritative forms of knowledges, scientific knowledges and expertises, and epistemologies of adimilima, experiential knowledges and expertises, contesting, as Sarah Ahmed notes, the understanding of emotion as the unthought and that of the rational as the unemotional. This history cannot be narrowed down only to the history of the birth control in Greece or the history of the debate of birth control in the Greek area. Instead, it is a political history of making knowledge and making sense of knowledge, the epistemological history of adimilima, or the political history of adimilima as an affective epistemology. It is fabricated through the parallel history of the politics of knowledge, body politics, and politics of emotions that appeared in the post-dictatorship era in Greece. Thus, adimilima is identified as breaking the silence in order for women to uncover and recover. It is the epistemology of the survival and the breath. It is the critical reinvestigation of the boundaries between theory, knowledge, and expertise. This is a history of theory where affective epistemologies of adimilima help us navigate what counts as theory, knowledge, and expertise by challenging and politically reclaiming the given and naturalized divisions of theory itself, bodies, concepts, epistemologies, emotions, and questioning the hierarchies they produce. This is a history that moves from the personal to the political, the scientific, the emotional, and the theoretical, but beyond their classification and within their co-production. This process of making sense of knowledge describes a world in which the meanings of the concepts are not created by opposing the meanings of other concepts. In other words, affective epistemologies of adimilima show how it feels to inhabit a world where the personal is not conceived as the non-political or non-collective. The political is not perceived as the non-personal. The scientific is not shaped by the absence of the subjective or the emotional. The emotional is not defined as the unthought or as a distinct from the senses. The theoretical is not constructed in the opposition of the body. Affective epistemologies of Adimilima read women's experiential and embodied knowledges that emerge in the blurred boundaries between academia and social movements as an act of backspeaking, a critique and response against the established forms of knowledges and expertises. Affective epistemologies of Adimilima were shaped by the 51 local feminist groups and women's organizations who developed their expertise in 18 different spaces and expressed their views in 86 magazines, publications, and brochures, organizing 140 events while connected to 40 international groups and associations working on birth control globally. But what were the epistemologies of the experiential? One of the main ways that women and feminists articulated the value of experiential expertise was through their authorship and translation of self-help books. These texts illustrated the interweaving of local, national, and international forms of knowledges, the transformation of these knowledges as it was reframed from different audiences, and the mechanism of production and circulation of new concepts of experiential expertise. Here I will refer to the influential feminist self-help health book by the Boston Women's Health Collective, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was translated into Greek in 1984 and operated as the Bible of the Greek birth control movement. The movement for the liberation of women's method of contraception, the Greek translation of Clementine ou la contraception, the Greek translation of the women's group in Denmark's Woman and Her Body. All these books were published in the 1970s. The multi-layered approach of this text can be illustrated by discussing the different types of expertise. In Our Bodies and Ourselves chapter on autonomy and physiology of sexuality and reproduction, the authors use text and the images to explain the structure and functions of the female and male reproductive systems while critiquing the standard scientific emphasis on difference and instead highlighting similarities in sexual organization and refusing standard boundaries between body and mind, science, and culture. An excellent example in their account of the menstrual cycle, which blends the biological and social aspects, ranking across pain, flow, and desire, highlighting women's different experiences of menstruation. This holistic view opens up a space for different forms of management of menstrual pain, including massage, extraction, manual vacuum aspiration to pass the menses at once, and orgasm. Similar concerns are developed within the coverage of contraception and abortion, where we can see practical information on contraception outlining how to use different methods and where there were female or male controlled and or involved interaction with doctors or not, and considering the effectiveness, risks, side effects, and costs of each. They also discussed abortion, providing information on the status of abortion under a different legal system globally, and what to expect when consulting a doctor, as well as the different techniques, practices, potential risks, and complications, including those resulting from medical mismanagement. The post-abortion care. Here we also see the specificity of Greek conditions within the global context, such as the paradox of abortion in Greece, illegal, expensive, and dangerous, but nevertheless often the only method of preventing birth. Greek gynecologists frequently perform a performance of curettage without even a pregnancy test. Then doctors' refusal to assist with contraceptive guidance or provision related to their perception of abortion as one of the many contraceptive methods. These texts were often critical of existing healthcare system, but did not attempt to replace scientific and medical expertise. They placed scientific and medical information alongside evidence, centering women's perspective and experiential expertise. The introduction to Our Bodies, Ourselves elaborates on the author's efforts to gather scientific knowledge through talking to the medical community, presenting in parallel women's opinions, expertises, and emotions. For the authors of Woman and Her Body, this approach challenged the dominant masculine language that had excluded women and replaced it with a shared female voice that could speak for women's pleasures and pains. These issues are apparent in many books. In the list of questions women should ask their doctors and or vice versa, or in the importance of the familiarity with the medical terminology that has enabled them to communicate with doctors and deconstruct myths. As they insist, when women understand how their bodies work, they can manage health on their own terms and more effectively manage their relationship with the doctors, including action in the event of medical mistreatment. This text consistently provided practical information on what to expect from medical encounters. For instance, a detailed description of how doctors fit IUDs and how to obtain the best results from them, such as what questions to ask doctor when seeking an abortion, including methods, locations, and prices. They also put forward alternative methods of bodily management, equipping women to take matters into their own hands. Woman and Her Body tells women how to chart ovulation by examining their cervical mucus and provides step-by-step guidance on fitting their own diagrams. It also provides a detailed discussion of cervical self-examination, a practice often undertaken by closed women's groups in Greece, including how to use a dilator, mirror, and a light, what women should expect to see, and how to interpret differences in mucus consistency or discharges. Our bodies ourselves explicitly position itself against the traditional social and ethical order by defining contraception in positive terms as enabling women to enjoy sexual relationship without the stress of the pregnancy. As an extension of its discussion of cervical self-examination, Woman and Her Body urges readers to know, love, and celebrate their bodies through masturbation. In this way, feminist self-help books centered on a radical form of alternative self-knowledge that may have incorporated traditional scientific knowledge, but was far removed from it in its aims, forms, and possibilities. Another manifestation of Greek women's involvement in transnational feminism and the type of expertise they developed was the international network and the communication channels between the Greek and other feminist birth control movements. Between 1974 and 1986, the Greek women's movement has a transnational exchange of ideas, practices, and materials, developing a sense of belonging to a global community that struggles for reproductive rights and empowerment. For example, one pamphlet provides information about the Danish feminist group, the Book Woman, who ran a second-hand bookshop and organized exhibitions and meetings that addressed women's groups in Scandinavia and worldwide about birth control. The Greek feminist birth control movement hosted similar spaces, including the women's bookstore and the bookstore, the book, and the child. Similarly, the newsletter of the Women's Reproductive Rights Campaign, discussing news and actions around the world about abortion and contraception, indicates the multidirectional movement of knowledges. Its presence in Greek collections shows Greek women's involvement in global feminist networks, while the content of the newsletter shows how the WRRC operated as a platform for feminists around the world to share their experiences and also their actions. Such examples depict how knowledge circulated and therefore how expertise was constituted. The materials describe the global struggle for women's rights, including access to contraception and abortion, but their existence reveals skills in communication and organization as essential forms of expertise for the women's movement. This point is reinforced by material documenting Greek women's and feminist involvement in international conferences on women's health and reproductive rights, such as the Women's International Information and Communication Service Conference on Women's Health in Geneva in June 1981, or the International Tribunal and Meeting on Reproductive Rights in Amsterdam in 1984, where Greek women from the Autonomous Women's Movement and the Multinational Women's Liberation Group took their place among 400 women from 65 countries. In both cases, Greek feminists contributed discussions on diverse topics, including contraception, abortion, sterilization, and population control, pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, massage, natural medicine, yoga for birth control, the politics of self-help, the paramedical work, lesbian health and the relationship to poverty, racism and health, and circumcision, violence against women's sexuality, menopause, madness, and international feminist networks. They also co-organize sessions to exchange practical knowledge and skills on massage, diaphragm use, the menstrual cycle, herbs, family planning practices, and also self-examination. These archival traces show that women and feminists exchanged ideas about organizational issues and practices, shared their situated birth control experiences, and redefined knowledge and understanding of multiple issues through their collective actions. This redefinition constituted an essential aspect of their experiential expertise and was based on their ability to transform a personal into a collective experience. The flow of knowledges and collaboration between feminist birth control movements across different parts of the globe broke down boundaries and created new forms of knowledge and expertise that cannot be measured, recorded, or understood through inflexible definitions and sharp distinctions that originate out of the traditional scientific and social order. The Greek feminist birth control movement was embedded in international communication channels. They placed the discussion of birth control in dialogue with multiple other topics, including women's anatomy, sex education and sexuality, as well as abortion. They located these discussions with a critique of the entire political and social order and its manifestation in scientific and medical systems and orders of knowledges that replicated patriarchal assumptions and power dynamics. In doing so, the questions established ways of knowing. They explored different sources of knowledges and created different ways of knowing that combined scientific, medical, and experiential expertise, but did not assume the primacy of traditional, formal, and abstract expertise. They also infused medical science with their own knowledge and expertise, including alternative approaches, definitions, prioritizations, and categorizations. This validation of experiential expertise transformed access to contraception and the practice of birth control into a political issue fundamental to women's body and sexual autonomy and their liberation. But can we frame this kind of experiential expertise with existing theoretical themes from different disciplines? Expertise, and more specifically, the analysis of different types of expertise, is a significant concern of science and technology studies. Here we see that experiential expertise has been developed in science and technology studies through the main keywords, through a more positivist vocabulary, mainly based on stable and closed dichotomies and normative typology as part of the analysis of expertise. More specifically, the inclusion of experiential expertise in the analysis seems to come from the top, from the analysis of science itself, while in parallel, it is oriented towards problem solving through scientific solutions. Moreover, communication here is intertwined with expertise only in terms of legitimization, while at the same time the concept appears as a gender-neutral category, where gender can only be one of the multiple aspects. The recognition of other types of expertise and experts aims to democratize knowledge production based on inclusion and equal distribution of the benefits of science. But at the same time, it keeps space for expertise that is not the property of the general public. Hence, treating experiential expertise as the other of science creates an antagonistic and contested relationship between the two. Approaches to experiential expertise within health studies usually start from a different premise. Here, there is a concern of bridging the gap between experiential and professional knowledges to democratize knowledge, empower patients, and improve participation in healthcare. Health studies scholars are keen to understand how different aspects of identity affect health experience and how subordinated groups create experiential expertise as a form of resistance to dominant knowledges and domination. In contrast to science and technology studies, the crucial question here is not whether experiential expertise is scientifically accurate or even whether it can be reconciled with scientific knowledge, but rather how people come to know in particular ways through their own ultimate irreducible experiences of the world. More specifically, here the vocabulary appears to be softer and with a positive sign. Indeed, the content analysis shows a more considerable emphasis on connections rather than distinctions, while at the same time, we notice the presence of a critical approach towards the role of science in discrimination. Indeed, in some cases, the authors highlight the need for a feminist epistemology, while the context emphasizing more on issues of complexity, the role of politics, knowledge, and hierarchies. Moreover, here the role of researchers is apparent, while at the same time communication refers both to experts and the others, the lay people, and the distinction between knowledge and expertise becomes more malleable. Despite the differences, health studies' interest in experiential expertise always comes back to the scientific expertise and its enrichment. Scholars in both science and technology studies and health studies tend to define experiential expertise as derived from lived experiences rather than scientific knowledge. It is usually presented as a form of expertise that is highly situational and dependent on aspects of identity, such as gender, race, class, and place, rather than on abstract concepts of objectivity, rationality, and truth. In science and technology studies, scientific expertise always holds primacy over other forms of knowledge. In its most rigid form, science and technology studies try to squeeze experiential expertise into categories created for analyzing scientific expertise, and unsurprisingly finds it lacking in these terms. On the other hand, health studies scholars describe experience in a more positive term, emphasizing the value of empathy, emotion, embodied experience, and co-production in healthcare. They are likely to emphasize the potential connections between experiential and scientific knowledges, but are also more overtly critical to the logic of the otherness and the structure of scientific knowledge that perpetuate discrimination against those groups and values deemed to be the other. In a sense, both fields position experiential expertise and scientific expertise in opposition to each other. So far, so good. But by employing feminist perspective, we can see how and why experiential expertise as a distinct gendered concept and or a way of knowing has been devalued within a body of disciplinary subfields and a broader system of knowledges and its potential powers to subvert those systems of knowledge and empower marginalized groups. Here, Ahmed's theoretization of sweaty concepts, I think it's helpful. Influenced by Audre Lorde, Ahmed coined the term as a way of giving words to redescribe a situation that dominant languages were not intended to analyze and that do not fit in the existing social order, such as how it feels to inhabit a Black body in a world that assumes whiteness. Ahmed argues that centering the difficult experience of a body that is not at home in the world can create new viewpoints and therefore new descriptions for the world. Her analysis aims not only to explore such difficult experiences, but also to create a new language to describe these tough experiences that resist full comprehension within existing categories, and in this way to legitimize the experience of marginalized and invisible groups. Approaching experiential expertise as a sweaty concept means asking, how does it feel to produce and circulate knowledge in a world that denies your right to do so? How does it feel to relate the type of knowledge you produce to science when science does not accept any different kind of knowledge? As Ahmed points out, in answering these questions, the difficulty appears both in experience and in the description of it. Women and feminists of the Greek birth control movement were excluded from the production and circulation of knowledge and therefore experienced difficulties in creating new networks, practices, and methods to communicate science themselves. At the same time, me as a researcher coming from science studies, I have difficulty in theorizing and describing the concept with the available analytical tools. This created a symmetry between me as a researcher and my research subjects. Another aspect of this intersubjective difficulty is that the fullest history of this movement can only be reconstructed from informal archives and is still incomplete. If experiential expertise is a sweaty concept, piecing together how these women found to demonstrate its value is likewise a sweaty act. Here, I have theorized women's and feminist experiential expertise through Ahmed's prism of sweaty concepts. This feminist methodology highlights the importance of bringing to the surface difficulties we encounter in our concepts, theories, and methods. Instead of tidying up our theoretical seams, this methodology incorporates these difficulties and makes them valuable for understanding the concept of experiential expertise. Archival materials show the transmission of multi-layer body of knowledges that combine the practical, the utopian, the technical and the emotional, the abstract and the situational, the scientific and the experiential. The concept of experiential expertise developed by women and feminists was derived from the body and directed to the body. It was concerned with the body and its liquids, sweat, blood, and discharges, but also showed how women experience these bodies, their feelings of trauma, pain, and isolation, and their as yet unrealized potential of pressure. To trace the development of experiential expertise as a sweaty concept, I have followed the production and circulation of knowledge that derived from a marginalized social position, from an unfamiliar and invisible space, and from bodies that protested at their suffering. As Athanasiou has argued, Ahmed's work calls for making vulnerability and weakness a stepping stone rather than treating them like a collateral loss, for making concepts assailable by using language to expose the dramatic experiences that are part of their formation. Unlike approaches that continuously multiply even more specific categories of knowledges and expertises while still excluding some forms of understanding, this approach remains fluid, flexible, and open, and can follow and reveal the complexities and transformation of knowledges in action. Women and feminists sought to actively participate in making their own health and liberation. These are the affective epistemologies of Adimilima, and they were developed through the difficult work of aligning knowledge-making and world-making practices. They weren't developed to describe a world, but instead, while they were emerging, a new world emerged with them. I argue that the feminist birth control movement arises through the interplays of history, epistemologies, and politics, while it embodies two parallel processes at the same time: the development of the political agenda and the formation of knowledge. I prefer to discuss those aspects as phenomena that are simultaneously embodied in the feminist birth control movement and equally construct its content rather than separated and chronologically distinct perspectives. This approach enables me to transcend traditional boundaries between politics, science, and knowledge production, utilizing feminist critique from a historical perspective. Additionally, this methodological and analytical position situated both me and my research in the ongoing theoretical and, above all, disciplinary discussion, or better, negotiation, of the boundaries between history, politics, and knowledge. This discussion, I believe, includes at least three different layers that can be summarized here: a history of a social movement that can be a history of knowledge, a history of knowledge that can be a political history, and altogether to fit in histories of the history of science. This is crucial. Now, on October 27, 2024, in Philadelphia, Kamala Harris addressed Gen Z in a public speech, asking them to make their presence known. When they responded enthusiastically, she remarked, "For them, this," referring to the upcoming elections, "is not theoretical. This is not political. This is about your lived experiences." I considered opening today's talk with this quote, but I think it's better situated at the closing reflection. Lived experiences have been theorized and politicized in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Taking it for granted in the following decades, we miss the importance of the conceptualization and theorization they need, the political needs to conceptualize and theorize them, to keep them political constantly. Without any attention to point the figure to anyone, especially in this critical moment, I wonder though, and I ask you to think with me, which is for us, for those who fight for democracy, equity, and equality, the current historical context that requires the depoliticization of the lived experiences and the acceptance of the conceptual hegemony of the theoretical as the non-political. In the context of anti-gender movements and anti-intellectual politics, the continuous social crisis, injustices, and precarity, the threats to reproductive rights, what is that thing that allows counter-political narratives to adopt this clear-cut division that hold different epistemological statuses and create hierarchies that reappear and become part of our discourses? Sarah Ahmed argues that the personal is theoretical, and in fact, that theory can do more the closer it gets to the skin. Thus, the personal is political because it is theoretical, but theory is neither abstract nor neutral. It is saturated, vulnerable, and difficult to navigate and create it. In that sense, critical epistemologies disorder the orders, and when they arise, align social and epistemic justice. This is what affective epistemologists of Adimilima did in the Greek feminist birth control movement. They produced relationalities between the body, the world, and theory, while at the same time, they reoriented the status of knowledges and expertises. They are the proof of experience of survival, even if their subjects and their histories were not expected to survive. They can be scarce in the name of love and protection. They are shaped not only by the limits, but also by their possibilities. They were constructed not only by traumas, but also by care. Hence, the history of the affective epistemologies of Adimilima is the history of the injustice that leads us to past histories of injustices in order to produce histories of justice. They situate women's struggles of the 20th century to the political demands and commitments of today's struggles. The struggles around the histories of being women or fighting, as Edouard Louis writes, for the right to be a woman. Not as an essentialist category, but rather as a radical identity of resistance. Affective epistemologies of Adimilima shape how those of us who identified as women make sense of the world around us as it is shaped through the processes of making sense. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. We move on to what is the discussion portion of today's presentation. We're inviting the audience members to contribute their questions. Also, those of you joining us online to use the Q&A function to post your questions. If I may use my role respectfully and ask two questions that I have, as everybody else is preparing this. What do we know about the profile of the leading figures of the feminist movement, of the feminist birth control movement in Greece? I'm wondering if we do have, let's say, students in health sciences, or is it inclusive, age group? Do we have, let's say, examples of leading figures? What are the profiles, and what is the average member as well?
So as I said, we have autonomous groups and at the same time associations and organizations of women that were mostly related to political parties. So leading figures we found mostly in those organizations and associations linked to political parties, like the Union of Greek Women associated to the PASOK. And Margaret Papandreou, of course, who was a very, very important figure in this political movement.
The first lady at the time.
Yes, exactly, correct. So there is a complete difference between those two, while on the autonomous groups, we have a non-hierarchical or hierarchical groups. So there is no leading figure, there is not such a thing. While they promote more the collective top-down, bottom-up approach. While at the same time, the women's organizations and associations, they do have a more strong structure with a hierarchy and with leading figures. At the same time, in the autonomous groups, we found many of them in the universities and in all kinds of schools and departments, like in law school or in school of philosophy, or at the same time in the school of medicine we have, or school of biology. So I would say in terms of age that mostly they were young women, But I think at that point, and especially after the second half of the period, like the late 70s and beginning of 80s and onwards, I think that the feminist movement is so wide that we see many different kind of identities within the identity of women. So we have also women from rural countries, rural areas, I'm sorry, elder women. So we have many different kind of characteristics in women. Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
One more question before we, in terms of, you mentioned the difficulties in terms of finding materials and what I assume is not an organized archive. For those of us who are interested in looking into it, where could we look for them? And are there any online resources?
That's a very good question. Yeah, thank you. So in my research, I used different kind of archives. I didn't say much about this here, but I examined different publics that were related to the issue of birth control. That means that I studied also the newspapers of general interest, the medical community with their textbooks and proceedings and scientific journals, etc., and then the feminist groups, and also the state archives and the discussions in the parliament and the law, and the para-ecclesiastical discourses as well. And all these archives, they have different archival centers that they host them, right? So the most difficult, of course, to find were the feminist ones, which were not so difficult in the end, right? So for the feminist archives, the main archival center in Greece is the Secretary of Gender Equality that hold a very wide selection, let's say, for feminist archives since today. So my first encounter was with them, and it was really helpful. And they had especially a very strong collection of the magazines, the feminist magazines and newspapers. But I wanted more than that. I wanted like informal archives, like brochures or many different kind of proclamations, posters, and even handwritten notes. So one of the leading figures in feminist movement in Greece is Anna Michopoulou, is a historian and researcher on women's history. And she holds, with the help of other women and volunteers, the feminist archive in Greece, Delphis Archival Center, which is a very interesting space itself, while it was part of the first women's bookstore that opened up during the 1980s in Greece, and it was on the backside of the bookstore. And they kept it till today. They transfer it from generation to generation. They pay the bills for the space themselves, feminists themselves, and Anna. Of course, in the discussion in the MGSA, I was talking about these archives because it's very interesting. If you see now, Anna her car is always full of posters and stuff that she's collecting from Athens, from feminist initiatives. So in a way, she still continues to collect history and to produce history. And to me, this is a very interesting archive in terms of my experiences as a researcher, because it is the first experience that I had with an archive that helps you to create history. So the structure of the archive, Anna's presence, how she dealt with the archives, how she helped me with the archival material, the fact that she gave me access to stay in the space, work in the space, at the same time search for the material right there. It was a very unique experience, and I think it's completely different for the experience that we have from state control archives. Thank you.
Questions from our audience? Both online? Yes, please.
It's a kind of follow-up question. Are you doing yourself a question about your methodology, oral history interviews, for instance, to meet those people, the actors of the feminist?
Yeah, thank you for this interesting question. I think it's something that I think about for years now. So in my PhD, the archival material ended up to be huge. So I didn't have space in my dissertation for oral histories. But I think it's something that I need to do at some point, because it's important for these women to have a collection of their voices, and we can see their arguments, we can see their approaches in the archival material, but I think it's also important to have oral histories, and it's something that
My mother was famous.
Okay.
So with an NGO, Progressive Women Association. So there's still a lot of things to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are some projects in Greece right now that they try to create a collection of interviews of oral histories, collection of materials as well. Like the one project is called "This Is Not a Feminist Project," and yeah, they do a great job. But I think I need to do that at some point. Yeah.
No questions. Yes, go ahead.
There's a number of questions, but there's dinner for some of them. I'm going to start with an off-center one that came to my mind when you had some of the posters and you have how do you collect your information about contraception and ectosadika.
Ectosadika, yeah.
It's like a puppy mill for having abortions. It's like an industrial illegal kind of space conceived. But at some point, as you said, there are these structures of power between women and doctors, right? And before legalization, there is also economic incentive, and illegal abortions are a lot of money and a big business. Is there a way in which the legalization happens in ways that provide rights, but at the same time try to accommodate the legal economy, and while legitimating it, ensure that profits of that economy are still in the system? Is there a way in which, let's say, social money that would now go for insurance keeps flowing towards a machine that needs to be converted into a legitimate machine?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of how the Americans did Obamacare. We can't do proper health care service. We're going to ensure that insurance companies will keep getting lots of money. Do we see any of that? So
that's a very interesting question, I have to admit, and difficult one. So one thing is that indeed, when the regime was for abortions was illegal, the profit was extreme. It was at that point 1,137, I think, gynecologists in Greece overall, and they had billions of profit. Illegal abortions in Greece were very expensive, and as I said, it was 300 to 500,000 per year. The number is crazy. Now, was a matter of profit? No. To me, it was a matter of ideology. Is ideology related to profit? Yes, but in a very indirect way, I would say. So for nowadays, that after the decriminalization of abortion, I think it's not so much about the profit, but it results on the profit. So now I think it's about the culture that maintains abortion as an ethical issue in Greece and not as a medical practice. And we still experience that, even though we have one of the most clear-cut laws in Europe now about abortions. But still, culturally, abortions are not legitimized, to my opinion, yet. So in theory, we have access to public hospitals for an abortion. In practice, you will find many doctors refuse this practice. You will find even doctors in the private sector to refuse the practice of abortion, using arguments such as, sorry, I don't do abortions. And unfortunately, I know no one who does abortions. So this, in a way, of course, ends up in private sector, in specific doctors, in specific hospitals, private hospitals, right? So there is a big difference between being an immigrant and wanting to have access to abortion and being a rich Athenian wanting to have access to abortion, right? Even though the law covers everything, you end up going in a hospital. A few years ago, we had an incident in Alexandria Hospital, I think, when it was in public, in press, when a woman went for an abortion and the doctors and the healthcare practitioners didn't say, no, we won't do it, but they didn't encourage her to do it. And they didn't create a safe environment for her to to proceed to the procedure, the medical procedures. And this, of course, ends up for the rest of the population in Greece that have access to private hospitals to end up in doctors that we know from words of mouth that they do abortions and they provide a safe environment for that. But of course, for that, you need money, right? And you need also to find out who is the doctor who does that and which hospital provides this service.
Numbers still very high.
Yes.
Because it's still used to some degree as contraception.
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the interesting fact is that until today, we have no official statistical data about contraception in Greece. We know nothing. We know nothing, literally.
I want to realize that second question, because this is so very interesting. So to 1986, right, is the law. You have a serious kind of goal that allows for mobilization, for organization, for resources to be put into action, to keep producing this knowledge, experiential knowledge, as opposed to state knowledge on abortions. Does 1986 become a catalyst for demobilization? And as a consequence, because goal achieved,
Oh, I
we
see.
still need to do that. And as a consequence, could we say that to some degree, if there is a case of demobilization, there is less of the experiential element. Now that suddenly the state and the institutional players become more powerful. And the reason I ask is that if that is the case, could that explain some of the rise of the more right-wing contemporary resurgence on abortion? Because I know that in terms of climate, and I don't even live in the country anymore, I feel a bit of a change. In the mid to late 90s, when the church tried to put a fetus on a phone card, there was outrage.
Yeah.
There was outrage. It was condemned aggressively. And now suddenly these practices are returning. And I wonder whether this has something to do with a certain demobilization. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Yes, the answer is yes. It has to do with this demobilization that you very successfully defined as a process. So I think that what happened in the meantime after 1986 is the fact that there was a mechanism of different processes that ended up resulted in the idea that we have about the feminist birth control movement as a movement for reproductive rights, and that's the end. So for me, what we are losing now in the context of the rise of far right and the rise of the threats of the reproductive rights is the fact that we have lost all these knowledges that we had, the experiential knowledges. And I think that I haven't got an answer on which is the mechanism yet, but it is something that I would love to examine, because I think it's a very important mechanism, even in the left-wing historiography, even in the women's historiography, that in a way de-aesthetize the feminist birth control movement and transforming it into a movement of reproductive rights. And I'm not saying that it is not. Of course it is, and of course it is important. And the decriminalization of abortion in the legal system, it was a huge step for women's empowerment and women's liberation. But I have in mind that in general, metapoliteracy, with all these social movements that were related to science, like the anti-nuclear movement, the LGBT movement for HIV/AIDS, they all were movements that were related to knowledge. And it was a moment in the Greek contemporary history that was full of the expansion of knowledge and the claim of knowledge from different social groups. And I think that through different kind of mechanisms, we lost this important feature of metapolitefsy, and this important feature of this social movement, such as the feminist birth control movement. And I feel that this is related to the institutionalization of feminism, institutionalization of left-wing knowledge and experiences, which again, I'm not saying that this is something that is bad. Of course, it is very important. Of course, it's a huge step for us to have archival centers, institutions that hold a history of feminism or of the left. But at some point and through specific conditions, we lost this huge asset that we had. This is my point. And I think it's an overall view that I have for metapolitefsy. And it's a discussion that I would love to reopen. And I'm discussing with some other historians in Greece that would like to reopen this discussion of what else does metapolitefsy have besides the rights? Or does the struggle for the rights entails different kind of features like knowledge, like science policy, like gender policy, and how these are interrelated?
I'd like to end on this note, unless there are any other questions from our audience. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks for this, and you mentioned towards ending both of your responses to these questions, you kind of touched on the points that I wanted to ask. So that there is no way of measuring perception and anything in Greece,
no.
Right? But I was thinking with metapolitefsy, and probably we can't talk before because things were not counted as much in terms of abortions. But do we see that the literature that was coming in to kind of educate feminist women and other women, really, that were available now around, say, Athens and other bigger urban areas, at least, on how to use contraception, right? So maybe can we trace the statistics, at least from metapolitefsy onwards, in terms of whether the abortions go up or down based on the education of contraception, which is often used in feminist movements as kind of, know your body, say no to no contraceptive sex, right? And Emilia was talking to a friend from Serbia about this, and we compared the statistics of Canada and Serbia, and both have kind of abortions widely available. Canada has sex education way more present than Serbia does, and the numbers are crazy when you compare the Canada kind of abortions in the two countries, right? So Canada's are way lower, even though Canada is considered a way more kind of liberal country where abortions would be more embraced generally, or at least not as stigmatized, and yet Serbia's numbers are kind of over the roof in comparison to what's going on in Canada. So just I don't know if you have any kind of sense of Greece and what's going on with the policy to the presence, at least in
such difficult issues. Yes, thank you. We don't count, we don't have these problems, right? So yeah, of course, the main narrative that we had a public debate about the sex educational programs in schools, like 2 years ago, not 2 decades ago, because we didn't, and we still have. This is something that now it's emerging very slowly. Yeah, we have no idea. We have no idea about how Greek citizens use contraception, which contraception they use, if they use, how many are the abortions. Because another interesting fact is that since the 1970s, that we know from the archives, and now in our days, in the surgical boards, they don't write the word abortion. They write the word apoxysi, which is curettage. So even if we wanted to count them, we cannot. It's a matter of language. So yes, I truly believe, first of all, when I was studying the archives, I was shocked, really. I was shocked because I'm in feminist groups. I am in the university. I'm an educated person, But the things that I have learned from them, I never had them before. I never discussed them with my friends. Of course, with my doctors, no. I've never discussed them with my family, most of them. So when I was turning to my girlfriends and we were discussing, like, I read this feminist magazine back in the 1970s. Do you know about that? And everybody was like, no, of course we don't know about that, Of course, now you can have access to this kind of information on the internet, but if you don't have an issue, are you in a position to start searching these kind of issues? Is it something that is in your mind, is your concern, if you don't have an issue? So, of course, I believe, I cannot measure it, but I believe that it depends on the experiential knowledge that we have. And we haven't had experiential knowledge in the last decades. And what is also interesting for me is why in the public debate and the feminists, of course, there are many different kind of feminism in Greece nowadays, but it's not something that is very popular, the topic of gynecology and abortions. And of course, it becomes very popular whenever there is a strong resistance, whenever we have an incident with far-right. We had a magazine on the metro, an advertisement of a sports magazine protecting the life of the fetus, etc. So we had strong opposition about that. There are many groups that they are active about these issues, but there is. I wouldn't say that there is a discussion in most of the feminist cycles now in Greece about this, which is, yeah, interesting at least. Yeah.
If there are questions, please join me in thanking our speakers. And before we part ways, I wanted to invite you to our next event. Tuesday, November 12th, we have a presentation by Dr. Panagiotis, student distinguished research fellow in Byzantine literature, who will be presenting on Byzantine crime novels in the 21st century. And then on Friday, November 15th, we'll have Dr. Mary Perro, actually present here today, Associate Professor of History and Visiting Scholar at SSU Center for Comparative Master Studies, who will present a talk titled Get Orphans, Armenian Americans and Refugees. Additional information on events and speakers for this semester can be found on our website at ssu.ca Hellenic Studies. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again November 12th. Thank you.